What we haven't seen yet is a right to the internet being recognized as a self-standing, independent right. What we are seeing is increasing recognition of access to the internet as an enabling right for a host of other rights. Not just freedom of expression, access to information, which are the typical ones that you would expect to be housed under a right of access to the internet, but health, education, basic services, the right to vote, political participation. These are all key, and increasingly as more information becomes housed online, and we see that to be able to exercise our rights, we need access to that information. Realizing that a need to be able to access the internet, both technologically, so having the infrastructure, as well as the means to be able to use it through the costing of internet, is critical for the enjoyment of all of our basic fundamental human rights. And that's true internationally, but I think in South Africa particularly, where the digital divide is still so stark that there is a desperate need for more active steps to be taken to make sure that that divide isn't perpetuated as in the way that we're currently seeing. Because there's multiple layers of access.
Okay.
So the one is around the technical infrastructure, making sure that all communities in South Africa potentially have physical access to the internet through the range of the telecommunications network. The second is having the actual tools to be able to access the internet, whether that's a computer, whether that's access to technology in public spaces, whether that's on your cell phone, as Africa is known as the mobile continent. We see increasingly mobile telecommunications as well. But then there's the cost of accessing it. So even with the infrastructure in place, if you can't afford it, access is completely meaningless to you. And there is where we really see campaigns growing. So currently there are now 3 separate investigations into the cost of internet access in South Africa. But that's still quite a slow turnaround time, given that this has been a complaint that's been raised for some time now, and given the high cost of internet access in South Africa. And we really need to see more strides being taken, and that's a multi-layered approach. So that needs to be better regulations from the regulators. It needs to be better steps taken by the government. Civil society initiatives have been strong, but perhaps not strong enough or coordinated enough. And the telecommunications operators really need to come to the party as well, and make sure that this is something that's feasible and realizable in the near future. But the added element to access, even once all of those things are achieved, is digital literacy. So even with affordable internet access, even with the right tools, all of that is meaningless unless people are properly educated on how to exercise their rights online and to protect their rights as well, and be able to use the internet in a safe and meaningful way that really makes a difference for them. So I think that the starting point is freedom of expression online. The right to freedom of expression, as we see it in Section 16 of the Constitution, as we see it in the African Charter, as we see it in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and a host of other legal instruments. It's the right to receive and impart information. And there is currently no more effective tool to be able to do that than the internet. The reach that you can receive and impart information is unparalleled. And that's really the core, one of the core rights. Access to information is a self-standing right in the Constitution, which again makes obvious sense. But as I mentioned earlier, there are also these ancillary rights that also have an impact. Being able to understand just knowledge of your constitutional rights is sometimes something that you can garner from the internet. The right to healthcare and hospitals, the right to public facilities, to make use of accessing government services. All of these things are more efficient, more effective, quicker, and cost-effective when seen on the internet, and really has quite a knock-on effect, which I think is why the internet as an enabling right has become such an apt term to really understand how it facilitates the enjoyment of a plethora of other rights. The difficulty with the online regulation space in South Africa is that there are different policies being enacted from different departments. So we have a slight disconnect between the Department of Communications and the Department of Telecommunications and Postal Services, who have put out different policy statements on it. As far as South Africa's particular goals go, probably the clearest statement is in a policy document called SA Connect, which sets out particular targets that South Africa aims to achieve. And that really builds on the National Development Plan and the vision that South Africa created for itself in publishing that. Unfortunately, we've fallen short of meeting those targets. The first set of targets, which should have seen 50% connectivity in schools and other public facilities in South Africa, have not been met.
What was the time frame? What was the deadline for this 50% connectivity?
So the deadline was the end of 2016, and the next deadline, which...
Where are we standing?
Well, we don't know, and this is the difficulty, because we don't have coherent statistics about what the target compliance has been like. We know that steps are being taken. There's budget being made available, but there's no statistic that shows that we have ticked this box or not. So in the department's reporting to Parliament in its compliance with this, which took place sort of in the middle of this year, it acknowledged that it hadn't met the targets, but again highlighted the strides that are being taken. So we are seeing sites, particularly in rural areas where there's been particularly poor access to the internet, in municipalities in the Eastern Cape, for example, that do have better connectivity now than we had seen previously. We're seeing initiatives that are trying to roll out broad public access, so for example in public spaces, in libraries, but there has been an acknowledgement that the specific steps haven't been taken. What also hasn't happened yet is what the policy called for was the establishment of a National Broadband Council, which came up to a particular point and was disbanded during the course of last year. So unfortunately, it's very difficult to assess precisely where South Africa stands on it, and also whether South Africa will be able to meet its next tranche of commitments, which aims to see 100% compliance or 100% of schools, public facilities and so on by 2020, which is a demanding ask, and hopefully one that we can come close to, but that's not clear at this stage. So again, I think this comes back to the debate about rights or the discussion about rights. And already you can imagine the number of rights that will be implicated. So somebody who's just completed matric, trying to establish whether or not they are eligible for university or to put in university applications, that's your right to education. Trying to establish what the job market looks like, that's your right to work. And in the ability, in the exercise of that right to share and impart information, there's a personality development. There's a fundamental opportunity for growth and development that we see there. That somebody without internet access is automatically disadvantaged because of that, and the opportunity to have. So I think the biggest thing that the internet offers us is this ability to be made available to different ideas, different viewpoints, a discourse that we don't ordinarily see, a robust and exciting and vibrant discourse. And without that facility being made available, that person doesn't have that enjoyment. So when we talk about zero rating, what we're talking about is making a particular service or access to the internet, be it a particular website or broader access, freely available to the user. But when we use the word free, it's a bit of a misnomer, because somebody ultimately has to carry the cost of that, whether that's the telecommunications company or whether it's the government or the person making it available. So for example, what we've seen is services like Facebook, through their Free Basics program, makes Facebook and other particular websites available for free to users, but that automatically promotes their website over others, and diminishes the neutrality that the internet would otherwise enjoy. So the debate is some access to the internet better than no access at all, versus whether or not it's appropriate for this kind of imbalance to take place. And without perhaps the coupling with the digital literacy and an understanding that this is not the whole of the internet, that there is a much wider base, the impact can be problematic. The additional aspect, I think, that's of concern with commercial services, zero rating services, is what happens with your personal information that you hand over. So even where zero rated services are made available, what you would also want to see is that there are robust policies in place to protect your personal information and make sure that users are aware of what information they're handing over to the social media companies or the other website or private companies.